final lesson in this series is basically the most effective thing you can learn no matter what kind of poker you're playing, and that's to pay attention to your opponents to figure out how they think and how they play. If you can figure out how your opponents think, you can figure out a way to beat them. But to do that, you have to pay attention to everything, even when you're not involved in a hand. Right when you sit down at the table, whether it's live or online, you have to start profiling all your opponents. If you play in a regular live game or a certain online poker room, chances are there'll be some familiar faces at the table, and you'll have a general idea about who the strongest players are and where the weak spots are. The truth is, most of your profits will come from the weakest players at the table. And as a beginner especially, you can make things really easy on yourself by avoiding confrontations with the strongest players and focusing on playing lots of pots with the weaker players. Speaking in really broad terms, there are 4 main kinds of poker players, measured by 2 main metrics. First, is the player really aggressive or really passive? And second, are they really tight or really loose? Passive players do a lot of calling and don't dictate the action in a hand, while aggressive players are the ones doing the betting and raising and generally taking control of situations. Tight players don't play very many hands and generally stick to strong cards, while loose players are always in on the action and don't need good cards to get involved. Profiling your opponents using this chart means you can make broad adaptations to your strategy when you're in a pot with them. So let's take a closer look at the 4 main kinds of poker players, how they play, and how you can change your strategy to exploit them. Loose passive players are the weakest of all because they're willing to take big risks with bad cards. And they also don't make very many aggressive moves, so you don't need to worry about them bluffing very much. If you're in a pot against a loose passive player and you make a strong hand, bet it aggressively for value and try to size your bets according to how strong you think his hand is. The point here is, if you think you have the best hand, bet as much as you think you can get away with without making him fold. These loose passive players are the ones you want to play the most pots against. Tight passive players are also generally weak, but they're not going to be as profitable for you to play against because they don't like putting their chips at risk. Against tight passive players, it's way better to try to win lots of small pots, even when you have weak cards. The main point here is that these players are only going to play a big pot when they have a big hand, so it's way more profitable for you to just make them fold all their marginal hands, even if you have bad cards too. Look for tight passive players who are willing to call raises before the flop, but tighten up way too much after the flop. Also, when a tight passive player raises before the flop, it can be profitable for you to call in position and push them off their hand after the flop because they're playing way too tight. It'll be really easy to spot the loose aggressive players at the table. They're the ones playing every hand and either winning or losing really big. Loose aggressive players rely on bluffing and aggression to win pots, but smart ones can also use that image to their advantage to get big value when they do make big hands. Your best line against a maniac is to be patient, try to make a big hand, and then give them the chance to bluff off their stack. Tight aggressive players are the most solid players at the table. They don't play too many hands, but when they do get involved in a pot, they fight for it hard. Since they're not playing a ton of hands, they generally get credit for good cards, but they also have the creativity to bluff and take strong lines with their draws, so it's really tricky to put them on a hand. As a beginner, you should try to avoid good tight aggressive players whenever possible, but their style can be used against them. Good tight aggressive players are able to fold medium and even big hands when they think they're beat, so they can be bluffed, but you're going to have to tell a really convincing story to make it happen. When you're considering running a bluff on a good player, make sure all the conditions are right and also consider what they think of you and what they think you're capable of. Remember, as you're profiling your opponents, they're doing the exact same thing. So that means that just because you saw them play one way against another opponent doesn't mean they'll necessarily play the same way against you. If you're new to the table and got a cold run of cards, your opponents might think you're super tight and try to run you over. That means they're going to give you a ton of credit if you come out firing, whether you have good cards or not. Or maybe right when you sat down you got a rush of great starting hands and your opponents think you're a maniac. That means the next time you pick up a big hand, they might not give you credit and try to bluff you. The main point is that table dynamics count for a lot and they can change quickly, so pay attention. Over the last 5 videos, we've covered the main differences between Hold'em and Omaha, the kinds of starting hands you should be playing in PLO, how to take advantage of position, how to understand complex draws, and most recently, the main kinds of players you're going to meet in Pot-Limit Omaha. So now that you know the basics, it's time to take that knowledge to the tables and get some experience. And remember, as you start moving out of the beginner level, you can keep studying in PokerListings.com's Omaha strategy section, where we have tons of intermediate and advanced lessons.